Hello everyone and welcome to my third video on this YouTube channel. Today I am reviewing an album that came out months ago and I'm finally getting around to reviewing it. It's the newest album from Magdalena Bay, Imaginal Disk. So I'm not going to pretend it's at all unusual for me to review an album months late, but this album, there are some specific reasons why it took me this long to finally get around to it. And a big part of that is because I saw just how much critical acclaim this has been getting, and I knew I wanted to make it its own review from the critical acclaim alone, before I even heard the album. I mean, you don't see this much acclaim for an album very often. It's probably the first time that I've seen an album get this much acclaim in over 2 years, since Ants From Up There by Black Country New Road dropped in early 2022. And that album, I feel like at this point, has gone down as one of the best albums of all time. Now, I personally wouldn't agree with that. I think it's a great album, but not really worth the insane levels of hype that it got, to me at least. But this new album by Magdalena Bay, I feel like in a few years from now, it may go down as one of the best albums of all time, if it hasn't already. The amount of acclaim this has been getting is next level, and I really wasn't sure what to expect from this album. Especially because, to be completely honest, their 2021 debut, Mercurial World, after revisiting it not long before listening to this album, I still don't really get the hype with that one entirely. I didn't fully get into that album. I tried, but it just wasn't really for me. Here comes the part of this review, or should I say one of multiple parts of this review, where I go on and on rambling about my own pretentious interpretations of art, where I pretend to be way smarter than I actually am and try to convince you of arguments that I'm 90% sure are not true. And thus, I'm not sure I was really supposed to like Mercurial World as much as the vast majority of critics. At least it doesn't feel that way. Because throughout that album, there seems to be this lingering sense of not good enough, where the tracks that felt the most like they had wasted potential musically kind of show a similar sense in the lyrics. And look, again, I'm pretty sure I'm overthinking this. I don't actually necessarily think that that's what Magdalena Bay were trying to do, but it's a theory that I have, and I could make a whole nother video about that album where I talk about that in detail. But look, assuming that that is not what they were trying to do, I didn't really have the highest of expectations for this album, or at least I wouldn't have had the highest of expectations for this album if not for the massive amount of critical acclaim. Because really, I don't think that's the kind of thing that you would do for a second album in a row. If that really was the intent with that album, I don't think they were going to try to do the same thing again with this one. Which means I kind of felt like it would just be more of the same, musically at least. Look, this album feels more optimistic overall, at least to me. And this is where this gets a little bit more complicated because there's a lot going on here lyrically, and it's a lot for me to process, and considering how many albums I'm trying to review and the fact that I do have a life outside of just making these YouTube videos, look, I didn't want to completely look into this way too deeply. I think the bigger problem that I ran into is that I'm not really the smartest person out there, to be completely honest, so I'm often one to miss obvious aspects in art, especially in lyrics. And look, I do like overthinking music in my lyrical analyzations. I think it's a lot of fun to try to figure out what's the deeper meaning. What are they actually trying to say here? And look, as much as I do like to do that, I don't want to overthink this too much. I didn't want to spend too much time trying to find some sort of meaning in it that I don't really necessarily think is true. But you know what? I did put a little more effort into this review than I do with most of my reviews. Again, it's why I wanted to make this its own individual video. And look, I do think there's a lot going on here lyrically. It seems to be a concept album describing the narrator creating a duplicate of herself. Although what that really represents is completely up in the air, and I'm going to have quite a bit to say about some of my interpretations of that. I'm going to stop right there for a moment, because the moment you've probably been waiting for in this review is where I tell you my overall thoughts on the album. Do I love this as much as the majority of critics? I mean, look, there have been quite a few albums in the past few years where there's been a huge, massive amount of critical acclaim, and I just haven't really fully gotten into them. I mean, you've probably read some of those if you've followed my blog. I mean, there's Ooh Rap by Ya by George Clanton, Javelin by Sufjan Stevens, an album which I really wanted to like considering the subject matter, but I just really couldn't get into it personally. Brat by Charlie XCX this year was massively acclaimed, and I thought it was good, but I just didn't really love it. There were some great tracks on it, but I didn't fully love it as a full album. Same thing with Scaring the Hose by Danny Brown and JPEG Mafia, and the list goes on and on. I mean, that new Jordy Griep album, which I reviewed recently in a mini review video, I gave it a 6 out of 10. I could see some of the potential in it, but I didn't really get into it as a full album. And look, I want to be honest in my reviews, and I don't want to just praise an album because the critics are. But look, this is arguably one of the most critically acclaimed albums of all time, and I was feeling fairly optimistic about this album. Look, I know I didn't love their debut, but this just felt like such a massive moment in the music critic world. You just know this is going to be topping so many of the lists of the best albums of 2024 at the end of the year, and it'll probably be on nearly every one of those lists. So look, I knew that I wanted to go into this with an open mind. I didn't want to convince myself that I loved this album no matter what. But I was feeling pretty optimistic. So, with all that being said, what are my overall thoughts on Imaginal Disk by Magdalena Bay? Well, I certainly think the production is better, with a much brighter and more polished sound, and there are more memorable hooks that stand out without the weird sense of insufficiency that was all over the previous album. And I also think Mika Tenenbaum's vocals have improved noticeably, where it feels a lot less like she's trying too hard to be technically impressive vocally, and there's more of an emphasis on giving the individual songs the right vocal performance that fits within that context. And I also think the lyrics on this album are more to the point, while still having some underlying nuggets that I think keep the mystery of the album without sacrificing the feeling of fun, which is probably Magdalena Bay's best strength, and the fact that they didn't use that strength more in Mercurial World was really frustrating, because you could tell the seeds of it were there. I mean, Secrets, Your Fire, showed that they had the fundamentals to create a really fun pop song. It's just that the melodies didn't really feel all that strong in that track, and the frustration in the lyrics just didn't really fit with that track sonically. And there's Domino, which had a pretty solid bass line, but the higher frequency sounds were too distracting and the hook wasn't super strong. Follow the Leader was a cool experiment with some interesting vocal effects, but it felt underwritten as a full track. And look, I could go on and on, but my main point is that Mercurial World had the right vibe to make a really fun album, but they sacrificed it to go in a gloomier direction with the writing. And again, it almost felt like they were intentionally sacrificing the quality of the album to prove some sort of point. And look, I've already mentioned a billion times that I don't actually think that was the intent with that album, and if it was, good on them. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but the point is, regardless, I don't think Imaginal Disk feels the same way. Feels a lot more like, more like your average pop album, but with a lot of experimentation as well. What's not going to make a lot of people happy is that despite the fact that I think Magdalena Bay have improved significantly in pretty much all the main aspects of this album compared to their debut, I'm still left feeling on the outside looking in with this album, because for as much effort as there was clearly put into this album, and as much as it's a sort of concept album with enough ambiguity in the way that I usually really like, I can't say I'm as high on this album as nearly every critic. And I'm noticing more and more as the years go on just how weird my taste in music is, and this album is more proof of that. It's been getting a massive amount of acclaim. Everybody's been saying it's one of the best albums this year. I can't say I agree, to be honest. And look, I'm not going to go on saying that Magdalena Bay were trolling their audience or anything weird like that. Even though I do think it would be, like I said earlier, I think it would be fun to do a review of Mercurial World someday, which would involve some really stupid conspiracy theories. I'll openly admit that. But no, this album's main issue for me, well, look, I'm going to have a lot more to say about this record, but a lot of it comes down to pretty simple things. Such as, even though I like a lot of the hooks on this album, there are also a lot that don't really pop off as much as I would like. There is a bit of a shortage of super strong hooks here. And there's also some moments where I don't think the production fully works. But look, there is a lot more going on as well, not all of which I really like. Look, it's not like I think this album is a complete fail or anything. So, I'm going to start this off by trying to untangle why this has been getting as much acclaim as it has been. And look, I'm not going to pretend that I completely get it, considering that I personally think I've heard much better albums than this year alone, quite a few. And the amount of acclaim this has been getting, again, it's rare that you see a new album get this much acclaim, so I'm probably missing something here. But look, I do still have some theories about why this may be, some of which I actually agree with. And the first point I want to make is not something that I want to spend a ton of time on, but it's something I have mentioned many times in the past, which is that I do believe lots of critics are more or less likely to praise something based on what the general consensus is, even subconsciously. And I'll admit, I'm not totally immune to that. I mean, I think I'm pretty good at not giving into societal expectations when it comes to the scores and reviews that I give, but look, I'm not completely immune to it. So look, of course, because Magdalena Bay were such a critically acclaimed act already, I would have been shocked if the reviews for this album weren't super positive. But with that being said, the fact that this album has been reviewed as positive as it has, the reception to this, again, I've already mentioned, this is the most critically acclaimed album probably since Ants from Up There. And look, it's gotta say something about the album itself, right? And look, I've noticed that this sort of psychedelic, trippy pop music does have a tendency to be worshipped by critics when done with enough experimentation. I mean, it's part of the reason their last album got so much acclaim, even though I thought the experimentation didn't really pay off, even if there even was as much of it as what appeared on the forefront. Now, this album feels a lot more out there than the first one, where even the poppier elements of this record have some seemingly bizarre choices. I mean, as much as Love Is Everywhere is a pretty straightforward pop song, not the kind you'd hear on the radio nowadays, but still a pop song in the same way that a lot of artsy underground stuff in the genre is. Well, look, I certainly wasn't expecting to hear a Lil Yachty sample on this album. Although, when I really think about it, it kind of does make sense. There's a bit of a similarity in the sound between this album and Let's Start Here. But anyway, I think the musical vibes of this album often relate a lot to what's going on lyrically. And I often forget that that is a very important aspect for music critics in general, and it isn't unique to me. I don't think you can deny that this album has a very otherworldly sound, whether or not you think it's particularly unique. It's got that psychedelic pop sound that people really love. And people also really love concept albums, and I think they mostly do a good job on this album with the lyrics. And while I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand the concept, I think I understand enough of it to be pretty fascinated. And besides, I'm not sure I'm fully supposed to understand the concept. The appeal of Magdalena Bay's music has always felt very much based on mystery, like I said earlier, and it's one of the things I really like about Imaginal Disk. And I think it leaves multiple meanings open to interpretation, with the possibility that they all may be somewhat accurate. The opening track on this album, She Looked Like Me, seems to be describing Mika's parents moving to America when she was a baby. And considering this song very much seems to be about herself, or at least some version of herself, she's probably talking about the inception of her life today as she knows it. And I really like the description of a mysterious figure in the third verse of this song. And she felt like a dream. I didn't know what to think. She looked like me. And she seems to be describing feeling totally enamored with this person, who very well may be an idealized version of herself that doesn't exist. I think the album's title is quite clever, because the imaginal disc represents a metamorphosis, such as the transformation into this other version of oneself, although it may only be imaginary. We'll never truly be able to be exactly who we want to be. And the laziness that resides in all of us that may prevent us from our goals is flipped from a negative to a positive in the next track, Killing Time. There's very much a message on this album that we're never going to be perfect. And while personally I've never fully agreed with the theory that if everything was good, we would all be miserable, and the idea of loving your flaws is really unhealthy and problematic when it goes too far, and emphasis on when it goes too far, because to some extent there is some truth to it. If we were perfect, we would never learn, and this track brings up the idea that we're not necessarily doing the wrong thing by taking some time to just chill out and not worry about responsibilities. We all need to do that sometimes, even though it doesn't always lead to that idealized version of ourselves becoming as much of a reality as we'd like it to be. Or should I say, that we think we'd like it to be. Because again, that duplicate described throughout the album seems to be in the narrator's imagination. And on that note, True Blue Interlude really drives forward the imagery of this unknown figure. The purest you, as Mika says in this track. And I also really like the line, something lies dormant inside and it's been there all along. Or you've swallowed it. Or you've spit it out. It's reiterating the idea that this figure described throughout this album is within us, but there may be more versions of ourselves that we aspire to be, which we've spit out, aka let go of. Then there's the next track, Image, and here's where it feels like the narrator really meets this duplicate. And it may be a sign that the narrator has taken steps to start becoming the person that she wants to be. The second verse seems to be a response to the first verse, which in theory are from this perspective of different people, but again, I think they're one and the same. And I'll admit, the next song, Death and Romance, is one of the songs here that confused me the most lyrically. And I don't mean that in a bad way. The opening line seems to be a reference to communism, and here's where I mention that I'm nowhere near knowledgeable enough about politics to talk about this right now. And yes, I know that's probably a problem. But I think that's mostly a non-factor in discussing this song, because I don't think the apparent reference to communism is meant literally here, but more as a token of the unity of this album, where the multiple characters described on it, again, are likely one and the same. And the sense of attachment described in the chorus is really captivating, followed by the line, "Nothing is fair in death and romance." I think this is pretty clearly a play on all is fair in love and war. But I've been thinking about this line a lot, trying to figure out the main point they're trying to make, and I wonder if it might be showing a fear of letting go. Now, I've also kind of wondered if the line "death and romance" is talking about orgasms, aka little death, although it's probably a stretch, especially as I'm not really sure it fits in the context of the whole line. Although considering the slight hint at autoerotic desire in the previous track and the chorus, I don't know, I wonder if there's some sort of connection there. But more likely, the death described here could be talking about the end of a relationship, and how difficult it can be to sustain that relationship and not knowing what to do when it ends. Although, again, that's just a guess, and I'll just say this line has stumped me. It's an interesting line, though. The next track, Fear Sex, seems to be describing some sort of separation of the two characters the album is about, where the narrator could be realizing it may have been best that they stayed separate and didn't get each other into the mess that they're in. In other words, the hope that the duplicate could become a reality led to disappointment in the end, hence the mess mentioned multiple times in the track. Although the title of the song leaves me intrigued by how unrelated it seems, and thus I wonder if I'm missing something in the lyrics. I mean, I'm probably missing something in the lyrics on most of these songs, but I especially feel that way about this one. But anyway, from there we get the desire-filled Vampire in the Corner, which is easily one of my least favorite moments here lyrically, with some pretty cringe lines such as, "Someone call the coroner, 'cause you're breaking my heart." And the whole thing just feels overly sappy, although I do think it mostly fits with the narrative, especially into the next track where that longing causes the narrator to depend on things which she may have neglected previously. And on that track, she also asks someone to meet the monsters inside themselves. And she may be talking about herself and coming to terms with the problems that arise when you try too hard to be perfect, or she may be talking to the audience to think about how much you relate, or she may be talking to someone else entirely, I'm not really sure. But I think the ambiguity and potential for double meanings really fits with the two-sided theme of the record. And then there's Tunnel Vision, in which the narrator seems to be realizing the problems with the dependence that she's been feeling on this other part of herself, where the desire now becomes improving herself, although that once again involves becoming a better version of herself. Just this time for the greater good, and not only purely to satisfy her own desires. And I like that it goes from this track into Love is Everywhere, where the love as her witness, described in the former, is revealed to be much easier to find than she expected, and she realizes that it's best not to overthink morals too much, but rather just enough. And along with the most people are good people mindset, it's probably the most positive and cheerful track on this album. And from that point on, it really feels like this album is a lot more just a bunch of fun pop jams than part of a larger concept in the last third of the album. And really, I think this album is about the idea of a potential better version of ourselves, and embracing the journey to try and become that better version, but also recognizing that we're not going to be perfect. And I also think there's a message of trying to be better, not only for ourselves, but for the greater good as well, and also that acknowledging our flaws is part of becoming that better version of ourselves. Yeah, it's not the most interesting, unique message overall, but I think there's something to it. And I like a lot of the ways that they try to send that message through a lot of ambiguous lyrics, which are interesting to untangle. And look, again, I very well may be wrong about a lot of this. A lot of this is just me making guesses as to what it's about. But enough rambling on and on about the lyrics. What about the music itself? Well, again, I think this is an improvement on their first album sonically, and there are more moments that I feel drawn to return to, although I'm also left feeling a little bit underwhelmed in certain moments. I definitely think this album has a more psychedelic sound to it, which I think is mostly to this album's advantage, because I do typically really like that style. It's just that on their debut it often felt compromised in favor of a lot more distortion and experimentation, whereas here there's still experimentation, but it doesn't lose the fun grooves and flashy production nearly as much. I mean, look at a song like Death and Romance, where there's a lot going on in the background of the verses, which I think are oddly kind of charming. There's a lot of aspects of the song which you'd expect to hear in experimental pop, but the bass line is still groovy, and it never feels like it overdoes it on the distortion. And another thing I really like about the song is how the chorus's big shots of sound don't arrive as quickly as it seems like they're going to, and it's a really interesting delayed gratification tactic that I think they pull off really well here. And then there's Love Is Everywhere, which might be one of the best produced songs on this album. I already mentioned the Lil Yachty sample from Running Out of Time, and Mika's vocals and the vocal layering sound really good with this production, which sounds super crisp and radio ready without holding back the chorus from floating like it does. But it is also one of those tracks where I can't help but feel like something is missing. And maybe it's just that it doesn't really do all that much to build on the sample. I mean, it's a really good sample, and I was just hoping for something more to be done with it. And really, that's a similar thing I've noticed with a lot of this album. As far as I know, there aren't a lot of samples on this album, but I'm not talking about samples. I'm talking about that lingering feeling that a lot of these songs should be a lot better than they are. And this goes back to Mercurial World, and it hasn't changed as much as I was hoping. But often it just feels like these songs could have used more magic, and instead we end up with tracks like Killing Time, which is a good song, and I like the lyrics, and it's kind of funky, and I like the groove, but it just doesn't pop off as much as it could. It feels like it could have used something more to really make it stand out more, and make me want to go back to it. And that's not to mention Fear Sex, which tries to pull you into its void for the outro, which takes up a decent portion of the track, and it doesn't really have any real atmosphere and just ends up reminding me of their first album and the moments where it felt like I was on the outside looking in. And along with some melodies which sound more sloppily written compared to the rest of the album, as well as the overpowering percussion, it leads to my least favorite track here. I also don't want to take too much emphasis away from some of the best moments here, such as Cry For Me, with the escapism of the writing being paired with some of the best production on the album, including a musical callback to the aforementioned Fear Sex, and it actually manages to sound really damn good, especially with the piano later on, which is the cherry on top in that track. The song has such a dreamy vibe to it without sacrificing the punchiness of the percussion, propelling that sense of adventurous wonder and excitement, but also a slight sense of fear. And look, I know I implied I was mostly done talking about the lyrics, and I mentioned the end of the album feeling mostly like a bunch of fun pop jams, which I think really fits this album thematically. But I do want to mention the line, "Spare me all the allegories, please," which feels like it could be talking directly to the first two-thirds of the album, wondering if there's really any deeper meaning to it all, or if we should just embrace who we are rather than how we got here. And thus, look, I could go on about the incredible vocal performance of Angel on a Satellite, the intriguing juxtaposition of the punchy percussion and soft synths on Tunnel Vision, which is one of the most experimental tracks here sonically, and how sick that bass line of Image is, especially paired with the absolutely crushing percussion, and especially That's My Floor, which as of right now is my favorite track here. Seriously, this song is a dance floor anthem. I love the groove on this track so much. It's so much fun. But really, I think there's a better way to end the review. Because again, I sort of wonder whether or not Magdalena Bay even want you to analyze this album, or if they just want you to enjoy it. And obviously, I don't know what the duo's intentions with this album were, and once again, I'm overthinking this. And yeah, overthinking lyrics is one thing that I do quite often, and it's kind of become part of my shtick at this point. But going back to that one lyric on Cry For Me, while I do think there is meaning to this album, it's not the sort of meaning where I feel like I have to come up with some sort of grand outro statement to conclude this review. The short and sweet of it is that I think this album is really good, and yet I don't really understand why it's getting as much acclaim as it is. With all that being said, I'm going to give this album a strong 7.5 out of 10. Because I think it's really, really good. I just can't call it great, in my personal opinion. But hey, while I'm on the topic of being carefree, or something like that, I think it's apt for me to put a special emphasis on something I would say about nearly any album that I review and I'm lukewarm on. If you like this, that's good for you. I just personally couldn't fully get past some production nitpicks and a few moments which just didn't feel as fully fleshed out as I would have liked. And again, as much as I really do like a lot that's going on in the lyrical concept here, I do kind of wish they kind of expanded on it a little more, made it a little more fascinating. But again, I'm nitpicking. Still a really good album. But again, considering the massive, massive amount of acclaim for this, I can't deny I was pretty disappointed by this album. But still, a really good album. I don't want to take any emphasis away from that. I do recommend listening to it if you haven't already. And yeah, I think that pretty much sums up my overall thoughts on Imaginal Disk. It's certainly quite something. It's very, very out there and otherworldly sounding, and it just didn't fully click for me. That's all. But anyway, with all that being said, thanks for watching this video, and feel free to let me know in the comment section what you thought of this album. In my description down below, there's my favorite and least favorite tracks listed. I know I'm still pretty new to making these YouTube videos, so I know I have a lot of improvement to do in my presentation and, actually communicating what I'm trying to say a little more clearly, and I still have a lot of improvement to do in the writing of my reviews. This review, again, it was compared to most of my reviews, it wasn't that thrown together. But again, I didn't want to spend too much time trying to analyze everything about it and make sure I get everything completely right. I was just like, you know what? I want to try to understand it somewhat, but I don't have to fully get every little detail and understand how it all fits together and everything. But anyway, thanks for watching. I will be back soon with more reviews. If you've seen this, maybe if enough people see this, I might get canceled because I didn't really love this album, but hey, it's just not really for me. I was a little surprised. So I thought I was going to like this more than I do, because, again, you don't see albums get this much acclaim very often. But anyway, that's all I have to say for now. Thanks for watching this video. Let me know in the comments what you thought of my video, too. Like, if you have any comments on my review, feel free to let me know. You don't have to love my video. I didn't have to love the album. But anyway, again, I know I'm going to watch this video in the future and look at how cringe it is. Again, it's only my third video. But anyway, before I go on and on and on for way too long, I'll end the video here. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all later.